Greetings. In this video, you will hear the most interesting and scary 5 horror stories. If you like these stories, you can subscribe so you don't lose my channel. Enjoy watching. The Wishing Well. It was an ordinary summer evening when Olivia first saw the old well. Hidden at the edge of the woods behind her new home, it stood like a forgotten relic, half swallowed by creeping vines. She was a city girl, used to bright lights and noisy streets, so the quiet countryside was a strange new world for her. But there was something about that well, something that made her heart race as she approached it. The well looked ancient, the stone walls weathered with age, the wooden bucket rotted and barely hanging on the rusted chain. No one in town had mentioned it. It wasn't marked on any map, and the locals would rather talk about the weather than speak of that place. But Olivia, ever the curious soul, found herself inexplicably drawn to it. The sun was dipping low when she arrived, casting long shadows across the overgrown ground. Her fingers brushed the cold, uneven stones as she peered down into the darkened depths. The air around her seemed to hold its breath, the usual chirping of birds suddenly absent. She leaned closer, the strange pull of the well almost magnetic. That's when she heard it. A soft whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. It came from the depths of the well. "Make a wish." Olivia jerked back, her heart pounding in her chest. She looked around, but there was no one. No one but the well, of course, and it was impossible for anyone to be down there. The well had no ladder. It was empty, as far as she could tell. Her instinct screamed at her to leave, but curiosity won out. After all, who wouldn't want to make a wish? "Why not?" she muttered to herself, wiping her damp palms on her jeans. "It's just an old well. People make wishes on them all the time." Olivia took a deep breath and closed her eyes, wondering what she could wish for. Money? Fame? A better life than the one she had been living? She had nothing to lose. She reached into her pocket and felt the crumpled piece of paper she'd found earlier. It was an old photograph, torn and faded, showing a smiling family standing near a similar well. On the back, someone had scrawled, "This is the wishing well. Be careful what you wish for." But Olivia didn't care. Her wish was simple. "I wish for something to happen to change my life." She threw the crumpled paper into the well, not thinking much of it, and turned to leave. But as she stepped away, a chill crawled up her spine. The air seemed to shift. Her footsteps, once light and unhurried, began to quicken. She glanced back one last time at the well and saw something in the darkness, something shifting. A face, pale and distorted, staring back up at her. But it was gone before she could blink. Heart racing, Olivia spun around and sprinted back to her house, not stopping until she was safely inside, locking the door behind her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, something was watching her. The photograph in her pocket seemed to burn against her skin. That night, as she tried to sleep, strange things began to happen. Faint knocking at her window, the soft creak of the floorboards, and worst of all, the whispering voice that seemed to follow her wherever she went, murmuring, "Make a wish." For weeks, the strange occurrences escalated. Her luck changed. At first, it was the good kind of change. Her job promotion came through. Money appeared in unexpected places, and a man she'd been interested in for years suddenly confessed his feelings for her. But it wasn't enough. Olivia found herself wishing for more. She wanted more success, more power, more validation. She kept returning to the well, making wish after wish. Each time, she felt the pull, the cold breath on her neck, the whispers of something darker waiting for her to ask for more. Then, one evening, after another whispered wish, Olivia's life took a turn. Her new job had put her in a powerful position, but with it came demands, sleepless nights, and mounting pressure. She was no longer in control, but a puppet tangled in the strings of her own desires. She had wished too much, and the well had begun to take its toll. One morning, she woke up to find the photograph she'd kept from the beginning, the one with the warning, lying on her kitchen table. The back of it had changed. There were new words scrawled across it: "Too much. Too far. Frantically, she rushed to the well, but it wasn't the same as before. The vines had grown thicker, the air colder. The well seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, and Olivia realized, too late, that her wishes had summoned something dark, something beyond her understanding. She had fed it with her desires, and now it was feeding on her. She was never seen again. The well beneath the old church. When David moved to the small town of Ashford, he was drawn to the quiet simplicity of rural life. He was looking for peace, somewhere to escape the hustle of city living and its never-ending noise. Ashford, with its centuries-old stone buildings and cobbled streets, seemed the perfect place to start fresh. The locals were friendly, though they always seemed to look at him with a certain caution, as if they were holding back a secret they were afraid to share. It was an old church that caught David's attention one early afternoon. It stood at the highest point of town, its gray stone walls worn smooth by centuries of wind and rain. A sense of desolation clung to the building, as though it had been abandoned for longer than it should have been. The doors were locked, but David couldn't shake the feeling that there was something important hidden within. He came back the next day, determined to investigate. This time, the door creaked open easily, and he stepped inside. The smell of mildew and decay was thick in the air, and the remnants of stained glass windows cast eerie, muted patterns across the worn pews. In the far corner of the church was a trapdoor, old and battered, with rusty hinges. It was as though the church itself had been hiding something, something forgotten and buried. David's curiosity was stronger than his caution, so he lifted the trapdoor and descended into the darkness below. The cold hit him first, an oppressive chill that seemed to seep through his clothes and into his very bones. The stone steps spiraled down into a vast underground chamber, the walls lined with ancient symbols and carvings. It was like something out of a nightmare, the air thick with the scent of earth and dust, and yet he couldn't stop himself from going deeper. At the heart of the room was an old well. The stone structure was strange, unlike any well David had ever seen. The water within was dark, nearly black, and the air around it felt heavier than the rest of the room. It was as though something was waiting for him to make the wrong choice. David approached it, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The well was ancient, older than the church itself, and its presence here seemed wrong, out of place. He felt compelled to peer into its depths, but as he did, a voice whispered from the shadows, "Make your wish." He froze. The voice was soft, almost gentle, like a lullaby that wrapped itself around his mind, urging him to act. It was coming from the well. David could hear it, like the echo of a distant memory. The warning signs flashed in his mind, but they were quickly drowned out by the lure of the voice. "Make your wish," it repeated, "and all you desire will be yours." David hesitated, his heart racing. But then his thoughts drifted to his wife, Amanda, and their son, Daniel. They had been struggling, financial problems, personal issues. Everything seemed to be falling apart. He didn't want to lose them. He wished for their happiness, for things to be different, for their lives to be perfect again. Without thinking, he knelt by the well, leaned over, and whispered, "I wish for my family to be happy, to be whole again." For a brief moment, nothing happened. The air was still, and David felt the weight of his foolishness. But then, the water in the well began to swirl. The darkness deepened, as if the well itself were alive. The air grew colder, and the shadows around him stretched longer. He took a step back, but it was already too late. The ground beneath his feet trembled. The well's surface rippled violently, and a low, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. Something dark, something ancient, was awakening. David tried to run, but the walls of the chamber seemed to close in on him. The whispering voice grew louder, more insistent. "You wished for them," it hissed, "but they will never be yours." David's breath caught in his throat as the shadows around him took shape. A figure emerged from the depths of the well, its form twisted and grotesque, like a monstrous reflection of the human soul. Its eyes glowed with an unholy light, and its mouth stretched wide in a grotesque smile. Suddenly, he was no longer alone in the chamber. The thing before him was not the only entity that had been summoned. Other shapes, other horrors, emerged from the dark corners of the room. They were the souls of those who had made their wishes before him, twisted and broken by their own desires, doomed to wander the depths of the well for eternity. David tried to scream, but the darkness choked the sound from his throat. The well was no longer a well. It was a prison, a gateway to a nightmare. And he had opened it. The last thing David saw before the darkness consumed him was the smiling face of the creature. It leaned forward, whispering, "You should have never wished." The townspeople would later say that David simply vanished. They would not speak of the church or the well. It was a place that had claimed many lives over the centuries, each one lost to the darkness beneath the stone. But some nights, when the wind is right, if you stand near the old church, you might hear a whisper carried on the breeze. Make your wish. The wishing well, the price of desire. It had been years since the disappearance of Olivia, the city girl who had vanished after making that final wish by the old well. No one in the small town spoke of her anymore, not aloud anyway. But there was always a hushed rumor, a warning passed in whispers, especially to the newcomers. No one ventured near that well anymore. It had become a place of dread, of foreboding, a place where wishes came at a price too high for anyone to understand. Still, not everyone believed the stories. Chad and Lauren were just passing through. They had been driving for hours, stuck on a long, desolate road with no signs of civilization in sight, when the gas light blinked on. The small town was their only option, and as tired travelers, they were grateful for the rest. They checked into an old, creaky inn at the edge of the town, unaware that they had unknowingly entered a place where the past refused to die. That night, after a long, satisfying meal at the local diner, they sat on the porch of the inn, enjoying the quiet, starlit night. Chad, always the adventurous one, began poking around the edge of the woods. "I bet we could find some cool stuff out there," he said, laughing and tugging at Lauren's sleeve. "Maybe an old shack or something, right?" Lauren was hesitant, her intuition tingling with a feeling she couldn't quite place. "Maybe we should just stay here. I'm tired." But Chad was already on his way toward the dark line of trees. "Come on, it's just a walk. You never know what we might find," he called back, his voice already fading into the night. Reluctantly, Lauren followed. She had always hated when Chad did this, running off without thinking of the consequences. But he was her boyfriend, and she didn't want to be alone. The woods were dense, the air cooler and heavier with each step they took. The trees blocked out most of the moonlight, casting long, twisting shadows on the forest floor. The deeper they went, the quieter it became, until there was nothing but the sound of their own footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Chad, ever the thrill-seeker, wasn't fazed, but Lauren's unease only grew. Then, they saw it. The well. It appeared suddenly, as though it had always been there, but hidden in the darkness. Its presence was imposing, the stones slick with moisture, and something about the air around it felt thick, wrong. Lauren froze in place, her stomach turning. Chad, of course, didn't notice. He walked right up to it, peering into the black abyss below. "Looks like a wishing well," Chad said with a grin. "Maybe we could throw in a coin and make a wish. What do you want, babe?" Lauren felt a shiver run down her spine. "No, don't." The words formed in her mind, but they never left her lips. "Why not?" Chad continued, already reaching into his pocket. "A little wish never hurt anyone, right?" He took a coin and tossed it into the well, watching it disappear into the dark. Then, he closed his eyes and whispered something under his breath. Lauren didn't catch the words, but something inside her told her that it wasn't a simple wish. There was an urgency to the way Chad had spoken. She couldn't stand it any longer. "Chad, let's go. Now." But Chad didn't move. He stood there, staring at the well, his expression frozen in something that wasn't quite joy or fear, but something in between. "What's wrong with you?" she asked, grabbing his arm and shaking it. But he didn't respond. His gaze remained fixed on the darkness. The air turned cold. A rustling sound came from behind them, and Lauren whipped around. Nothing. Just the trees, swaying in a breeze that wasn't there a moment ago. But the rustling grew louder, closer. Then she heard it. A voice, soft and insistent, a whisper rising from the depths of the well. "Make a wish." Lauren's blood ran cold. "Chad, let's go now," she screamed, pulling on his arm again. But this time, he didn't resist. His eyes had turned glassy, distant, as though he were no longer seeing her at all. "Make a wish, Chad." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was louder, almost a command, reverberating in the air. Lauren's pulse raced. She looked down, and the shadows around the well seemed to stretch and twist unnaturally. The trees groaned as though under a heavy weight. "Chad, please," she begged, her voice breaking. "Don't do it." But Chad smiled, a slow, eerie grin that made her stomach churn. "I already did. You should too. It's the only way." Before Lauren could react, Chad stepped closer to the well, his feet dragging like he was being pulled. And then, with a sharp intake of breath, he stepped forward, vanishing into the well's depths without a sound. "No!" Lauren screamed, rushing forward to the edge, peering down. But there was no sign of him. Nothing. Just darkness. Her body trembled, but she couldn't tear herself away. Then, the whisper returned, now louder than ever. "Make a wish." Lauren felt her body sway with the pull, her mind clouded by the voice. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she couldn't stop herself. A desperate thought bubbled to the surface, something she had wanted for years, something she never thought she could have. "I wish Chad were here." The moment the words left her lips, the air around her went still. A deep silence descended on the woods, the kind that smothered everything. For a second, Lauren thought she might have made a terrible mistake. Then, out of the shadows, she heard a voice. A faint, cracked whisper. "You asked for him." Chad's voice. Lauren whipped around, her breath catching. There, standing in the woods, was Chad. But something was wrong. His clothes were tattered, his skin as pale as death, his eyes sunken and hollow. His lips stretched into that same unsettling grin. "Chad," she whispered, fear rising in her chest. He took a step forward, then another, each one slow, deliberate. His movements were jerky, unnatural. His grin never faltered. "You wished for me," he said, his voice hollow, distant. "But you'll never be able to have me." "Not really." Before she could react, the world around her tilted. The woods spun in a dizzying whirl, and when everything settled, the well was gone. The trees were gone. There was only darkness and Chad, standing before her with that same chilling smile. "I'm here now," he said softly, "but you'll never leave." The wish had been granted, and the price of desire was a soul trapped forever. The wishing well, the curse of regret. Sarah had always considered herself a skeptic. She didn't believe in superstitions, curses, or the supernatural, at least, not until the day she moved into her new house. Nestled on the outskirts of a quiet, sleepy town, it seemed like the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. The house was old, a charming Victorian-style building with tall windows, creaky wooden floors, and a sprawling garden. But the more Sarah explored her new home, the more she noticed something odd. There was a well, hidden behind a thicket of trees at the far edge of her garden. It was an old stone well, its surface cracked and overgrown with ivy. The moment Sarah laid eyes on it, something stirred within her, a sense of unease, though she couldn't pinpoint why. The previous owners hadn't mentioned it. In fact, they hadn't mentioned much about the property at all. It was almost as if they had wanted to forget. On the first day, Sarah ignored the well, telling herself it was just another odd feature of an old house. But it wasn't long before she started hearing strange noises at night, soft, almost imperceptible whispers, as though someone were standing just outside her window, calling her name. At first, she convinced herself it was the wind, the house settling. But when she began having vivid dreams about the well, she couldn't dismiss it any longer. One night, after another restless sleep disturbed by whispers, Sarah decided she would investigate. She had to know what was going on. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the garden, she grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, her footsteps crunching on the dry earth. The air was thick with the scent of damp soil, and the night seemed unnaturally still. The only sound was the rhythmic beat of her own heart in her ears as she approached the well. There it stood, silent and foreboding. The stone was cold under her fingers as she touched the surface, feeling the deep grooves worn into the sides by years of neglect. A shiver ran through her spine, but she didn't retreat. Instead, she leaned over the edge, shining her flashlight into the blackness below. For a long moment, there was nothing but the emptiness, a deep, suffocating void. And then, from that darkness, a voice echoed up to her, a voice that wasn't her own. "Make a wish." The words were unmistakable, clear as day, and they sent a chill through her entire body. Sarah recoiled, nearly losing her balance, but she caught herself. Her hand trembled as she gripped the edge of the well. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice shaking. "What do you want?" The voice didn't respond. Instead, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if the very atmosphere around her was thickening, pressing in. The flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows across the well's stone walls, before going out completely. Sarah cursed under her breath and fumbled with the flashlight, but before she could turn it back on, she heard the voice again, softer this time, almost coaxing. "Make a wish, Sarah." Her heart raced. This is insane, she thought. There's nothing down there. It's just some prank. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Something had changed in her. She felt an irresistible pull, a compulsion to give in. The voice had the kind of power that made her doubt her own will. It was like the well itself was speaking directly to her soul, whispering what it knew she wanted most. She had always been someone who wanted more. More success, more love, more happiness. Life hadn't been easy. She'd worked hard to build a career, to be independent, to make a name for herself, but it always felt like something was missing. The voice, gentle but commanding, made her question everything. It was as though the well knew her deepest, most private desires. "What do you wish for?" the voice coaxed. Sarah's mind raced, torn between her instincts and her desperate longing. She closed her eyes, thinking of all the things she had ever wanted. But only one wish surfaced, the thing that had haunted her thoughts for years. She wanted her husband back. Her husband, David, had died 2 years ago in a car accident. A grief that had consumed her, fractured her life. She had tried to move on, to rebuild, but no matter how many days passed, his absence felt like a hole in her heart. She missed him, more than she could explain. Without thinking, she whispered, "I wish I could see him again." For a long, excruciating moment, nothing happened. No voice, no sound, just the oppressive silence of the night. Sarah stood there, her heart pounding in her chest, waiting for something to change. But nothing did. It was just the wind, the trees, the distant hum of the night. But as she turned to leave, she heard something, a faint rustle behind her. She spun around, and there, standing at the edge of the garden, was a figure. David. It couldn't be. She blinked, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were seeing. His hair was messy. His clothes were the same as the ones he had been wearing the day he died. But there was no doubt about it. It was him. He stood there, a ghostly silhouette in the moonlight, staring at her with sad, vacant eyes. "David," she gasped, her voice a broken whisper. He didn't speak. His eyes were empty, hollow. He was there, but he wasn't. His face was pale, gaunt, as if death had claimed him long ago. His lips parted, but no words came out, only a hollow, terrible sound, like a faint sigh carried by the wind. "David!" Sarah cried out, taking a step toward him. "Where have you been? What's happening?" But as she took another step, the figure started to fade, slowly at first, and then more rapidly, until the last traces of him disappeared into the night air. Her legs gave way, and she collapsed onto the cold earth. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she clutched her chest. What had just happened? Was it him? Or was it something else entirely? She didn't know, but she felt the weight of the truth pressing down on her. The wish had been granted. She had seen David again, but only for a moment. And now, the well had taken something from her in return. She hadn't seen it before. The mark? A small, deep scratch on her wrist, like a clawing thing had reached out and touched her. It was then that she realized the truth. The well never gives without taking. The cost of a wish was always higher than you thought. And sometimes, the things you wish for are better left buried, forgotten. The wishing well, the long wait. Tom had always been skeptical of old stories. He grew up surrounded by them. Ghost tales, haunted places, strange happenings. But he never believed in any of it. To him, it was all just superstition, local legends passed down from one generation to the next.